This presentation was made during our field trip to Siberian forests under field conditions, so we apologize in advance for the technical quality, which may not be always as high as we would like it to be. Hello, dear colleagues, dear participants of the climate conference, the bug beetle calamity and the role of the forest in climate and water circulation. I am now standing at the foot of the famous Zotto meteorological tower. It was established in 2006 to investigate the interaction between the vegetation cover and atmospheric dynamics, to measure all atmospheric parameters like temperature, humidity, and with an emphasis on CO2 emissions. As you can see, the tower is now deep in clouds. It has been raining anomalously for the last 3 weeks here. This tower is located 25 kilometers from the Yenisey river in Siberia. It is about 1000 kilometers north from Krasnoyarsk and about 1000 kilometers south from the Arctic Ocean. So it has been anomalously raining, but before that it was anomalously dry. As everywhere else, we are witnessing an increase in fluctuations of the water cycle. There are increasing occurrences of droughts and floods and extreme rainfall events. And also, as everywhere else, we are witnessing a massive destruction of the vegetation cover. Here, forests are destroyed by cutting and fires that follow the cuts. According to the biotic regulation concept that my colleagues and I are developing, there is a unambiguous link, causal cause-effect link between the water cycle destabilization and destruction of the vegetation cover. So you destroy the vegetation and landscape drying or landscape flooding follow. What is the biotic pump of atmospheric moisture? In brief, here we have a simple illustration. So the key process is the air moistening by the forest. It occurs via transpiration during the photosynthesis. So trees during their transpiration enrich the atmosphere with the water vapor. This water vapor rises with the air. The air cools, forming clouds, and the water vapor condenses, forming clouds. And as condensation occurs and the water vapor turns to liquid, the pressure falls and there appears a relative pressure shortage where condensation occurs, which pulls the air upwards. And as a consequence, there arises a pressure shortage at the surface, which draws moist air from the adjacent ocean. And here, over the ocean, the air is enriched in water vapor, and this import of moisture compensates for the continuous loss of liquid water back to the ocean. And the dry air after condensation descends over the ocean, and so the cycle of this water cycle, atmospheric dynamics, is completed. So What is crucial here is that condensation is predominantly located over land, and this is achieved due to the fact that the forest continuously keeps the atmosphere moist. So, for this cycle to function in a stable and favorable for humans way, without fluctuations, without droughts, or on the contrary, without flood events, the forest must be able to store water in soil, so to ensure continuous and smooth transpiration process. It must be able to transpire efficiently, rapidly enriching the atmosphere with moisture, and it should also be able to switch condensation off and on, that is to form clouds as it is needed under current weather conditions. And this can be achieved by producing biogenic condensation nuclei that serve as tiny spots in the atmosphere where condensation occurs. So even if the atmosphere is relatively dry, by adding condensation nuclei to the air, the forest can in principle switch condensation on, and so the process of the water import is initiated. The forest moisture pump, the biotic pump, draws moisture that evaporates from the ocean inland. And here this moisture, this water vapor condenses, falls out from the atmosphere as precipitation, as rain, as snow, and all liquid water ultimately runs away back to the ocean. This occurs due to gravity because land is elevated over the ocean. So all water leaves land and does it so very quickly. If there is no moisture import via the atmosphere, all moisture will leave land via runoff in just a few years. So this is a very transient store of fresh water on land. And so without forest and without this drawing moisture mechanism, the general tendency for landscape is to get drier. But this process is not smooth, and even without forest there can be extreme events with rainfall, floods and violent winds. And why it is so, I want to explain. Fluctuations of the water cycle occur in the absence of the forest cover because the condensation process depends on the vertical velocity of the ascending air. As you can see, as the air ascends, the moisture precipitates, and there is precipitation, and it can be strong and lead to floods. And the point is that this process sustains itself. So the faster, the more quickly the air ascends, the more air is coming horizontally from the surrounding areas, and this can continue as long as there are sufficient moisture stores around. So it is an erratic process. If condensation by chance starts over land in some place, it can sustain itself through this dependence of condensation rate on vertical velocity for sometimes for longer periods of times. This is the case in over the oceans where there is no forest cover, and where for the same reason severe fluctuations of the rainfall rate can develop in the form of hurricanes and typhoons. Meanwhile, as you can see, these are shown here tracks of all major tropical cyclones during the last several decades, and you can see that in the regions surrounding the big forests of the Congo and the Amazon rivers, no tropical cyclones form because the forest draws moisture away from the ocean, and so it controls condensation intensity over large regions. So the forest not just makes the water cycle on land richer, on average more intense, but it also guarantees that this water cycle is relatively smooth and deprived of major fluctuations. And it is also interesting to note that here we can see the Eurasian forest belt, and in summer, when the biotic pump works, it takes moisture away from the Arctic Ocean, so despite the temperatures are warmer, are higher than in winter, no Arctic cyclones practically develop in summer where forest is active. Meanwhile, they tend to develop in winter when temperatures are lower, but there is no this drawing mechanism, and all water vapor remains over the ocean. So a natural forest cover ensures that the water cycle is stable. Meanwhile, in the absence of a healthy vegetation cover, the landscape generally gets drier in the long term, but it can also suffer from occasional moist periods when there can be even more moisture than it is actually needed. So when talking about the large-scale factors that determine the water regime on a given territory, in a given region, we need to take into account the existing natural ecosystems, natural forests that are still extensive and can determine many processes that spread far beyond the territories occupied by the forests themselves. Here in this map we can see the relatively undisturbed forest landscape shown in green. As we can see, they are mostly concentrated within Russian borders, and the red color shows how much of them has been cut and destroyed, forest cover loss due to cutting and fire in the last 2 decades. So now we are here, the Zotto towers somewhere here, the border between cut and relatively intact territories, and this is Czech Republic. You can see that it is relatively far from this intact forest belt still, because this forest belt is enormous in its extension, nearly 7,000 kilometers. It impacts weather and climate far beyond the territory it occupies. So definitely what we need to preserve as one of the pillars of the water cycle stability is this relatively intact forest belt of Eurasia. And as we have discussed, there are many properties of the forest that must all be present for the biotic pump to function efficiently. And not all forest ecosystems are the same. So every forest type has its own functionality with respect to the water cycle. Here we can see pine forest that developed after very large-scale disturbances, fires and cutting. And this forest is, you can see, is dominated by very light cover of lichens, Cladonia species, and this lichen, when it is dry, when the weather is dry, it dries up and burns very easily. So it catches fire very easily. So this forest cannot accumulate much moisture and cannot protect itself after against future fires. But how did this forest type develop? There are interesting research papers, including those by Dr. Alexey Oleynikov, which show that some disturbances in the past by humans who practiced slash and burn agriculture, they or other activities, when they made large-scale fires and pine forest developed later, then subsequent fires concentrated on this pine forest. So in fact a large-scale disturbance somehow propagates itself into the future. So when the threshold of disturbance is passed, the forest cannot easily return to a state when it can protect itself against extra drying and against fires. Here we need human intervention. And you can see that in this forest the soil level is very, very thin. You can see, so sand is very near, so the soil layer is very, very thin and it can't store much moisture. You can see, although there are, you can see mushrooms, they are already, there is sand here already, so it is all very, very close, you see. But here also you can see the environmental function of large trees. You see here an island, a green island amidst this white field near the big tree, old tree, which was strong enough to survive previous fires. And here you can see that due to accumulation of organic matter from the falling needles, the soil and a richer substrate has formed, and here the species composition has changed, and here we can see berries are growing already, small shrubs, like you can see we have berries here. Yeah, cranberries in this case. And also you can see there are many such islands concentrated around big trees. So big trees serve as islands of a more water competent environment, and you can also see that they serve as nurseries for young growing trees which are scarce on the white field covered by lichens. So gradually, but the seed bank here is depauperate. There are a few seeds of other plants. So here probably with human intervention, with the introduction of genetic material of other trees, something could be done to turn this forest into a more water competent state, which will be more protected against fires. So what I want to say is that you can see another island there in the distance, concentrated also around the big tree. What I want to say is that comparing the water holding and water regulating capacity between different forest types, we can actually decide how to modify those tree stands in Czech Republic that are currently suffering from bark beetles, and how they should be helped to achieve a more water competent state, more water functionable state. What I want to emphasize that threshold disturbances like large-scale fires and large-scale cutting do not allow the forest to develop by itself into a water competent state. We need to help to interfere, but to do that in a wise and intelligent manner. So we can look at the pine forests here in Yenisey region, and also on spruce stand in Czech Republic, and we can see that while their history of these ecosystems is different, they have something in common. They have been disturbed beyond a threshold, and they now cannot spontaneously recover to a state when they will control their water regime and the water regime of the adjacent territories. So these ecosystems, if they are left by themselves, they will degrade sooner rather than later. And I will now discuss in more detail how this happens on the example of the pine forest ecosystem, because it is really very instructive. So here we can see an illustration of how this forest that has been disturbed before a threshold, before its ecological threshold, is now not sustainable. Here you can see that there was a big recent fire with many trees seriously damaged, and it destroyed all the lichen cover, because lichen dries very quickly and burns like dry paper. And more importantly, it also destroyed the undergrowth, the small trees that were growing, and the next generation of the forest. So if we return, look at the burnt area, we can see that as soon as these old trees age and die, there will be no seed replacement, no supply of seeds, and there will be a desertified place. Of course, here it is illustrated on a small scale, but when the disturbances are large scale, when cuttings and subsequent fires are of large scale, so will be the results. So the forest will ultimately disappear. It is a kind of death, delayed death of the forest. As far as trees are generally live long, this forest death doesn't occur very quickly in 1 year, so it seems to be a lengthy process, but it is not sustainable. And this is just an analogy to what happens in Czech Republic with old growth spruce tree stands. It is they were also established on a previously disturbed place after a cut, and so they are also not sustainable by themselves, and a very wise management is needed to gradually push them towards a more sustainable, more resilient, more natural state. And what this state is, what are its properties and characteristics, this we can learn by comparing different forest stands and their sustainability across different regions in temperate and boreal zone. So much serious research is needed, and also application of experience of researchers and forest practitioners who worked in Czech Republic. So we need a healthy vegetation cover for a stable and favorable water cycle. At the same time, different types of ecosystems and different types of vegetation cover have different self-recovery potential. As we have seen on the example of the pine forest in the Yenisey region, and also on the example of old growth spruce stands in Czech Republic, these ecosystems have suffered a disturbance that went beyond their resilience threshold. At the same time, there are disturbed ecosystems that still retain self-recovery potential, as this example of boreal forests which we studied on the shore of the White Sea in the north of European Russia. And finally, there are relatively intact ecosystems, like this example from Pechora Lychy State Nature Reserve in Russia, photo provided by Alexey Oleynikov, which still function properly and actually work to ensure stability of climate and the water cycle. So we have an ecosystem with very low self-recovery potential, with high potential, and relatively intact ecosystems. And while we need to preserve intact ecosystems and ecosystems capable of self-recovery, we need to preserve them and allow them to self-restore. We need to take care of the ecosystems with low self-recovery potential. This should be done urgently because their degradation is also facilitated by global effects of global climate change. So, if we decide to help the forest, how we can do that? What is the main difficulty for the forest, in particular for this pine forest, to reach sustainability? If we look at the lichen, dominating lichen, Cladonia species, you can see that when it cannot hold much moisture and dries very quickly, and then this structure burns instantaneously, and the soil layer is very thin and cannot store moisture. But if we look at natural lowerings, like natural small pits, like this small lake, we can see that nature helps the forest to store moisture, and everything changes. While we can see in the distance the lichen-dominated landscape, here near the lake everything is different. The lichen composition is different. There are mosses, there are shrubs, there is not only cranberry but already blackberries. So different types of very delicious berries, and so everything changes. We can see grasses, herbs, species diversity. So if we help the forest to store moisture in landscape, then this looks like an immediate and obvious measure to facilitate its transition to a more sustainable state, because you can see here we also see birch trees and aspen, and not just pine trees as elsewhere. So the strategy that aims at establishing small ponds, small pits that could store moisture, looks the right strategy. But of course we need to ensure that there is a substantial amount of seeds of the genetic material of all the species that must be present on the. We also need to mention not just forests but other natural ecosystems like wetlands, like bogs, marshes, which also cover significant territories and have a high water storage and water regulation potential. And for all these ecosystems, it is important to remember their function of uniform distributing the process of evaporation and the process of condensation. So these are mechanisms that not just intensify the water cycle on land via transpiration, but also serve to smooth the fluctuations of the water cycle to prevent catastrophic droughts and catastrophic rainfall and floods and landslides and things like this. So we need two strategies, one for intact forest ecosystems, which is global, more global, and the other one is for local ecosystems that require urgent interference. Dear colleagues, indeed here on the banks of the Yenisey river, which is one of the mightiest rivers on earth, it is, I think, a very good place to formulate this concluding message about how we should act to preserve a sustainable climate and a stable and flourishing water cycle. So looking at Yenisey river, at all these vast resources of fresh water which follows its way down to the ocean, back to the ocean, we realize that all this moisture has come to land via the atmosphere, and this dynamics is strongly influenced by the vegetation cover, by the forests, the Siberian forests, and the good news is that the biotic pump is still functioning, and we have what to preserve. So in order to ensure good and favorable conditions with respect to the water cycle, we need to pursue two strategies of different scales. One is global, and it is to preserve the remaining native and natural self-sustainable ecosystems, forests and wetlands that still work to ensure that the water cycle is stable and rich. And as we have seen, such ecosystems are concentrated mostly within Russian borders in Eurasia. And we do need a strong international movement with many local initiatives joining in the endeavor to formulate this category of climate regulating forests as a separate category, and to define it in legal terms, and to start an international program of their targeted research of their climate regulating potential. This is extremely important, and without this global umbrella strategy, all local efforts will be less organized and probably less successful. So we ask you to join our Russian colleagues in the initiative that we are trying to push forward to organize an international program of studies of the climate regulating potential of undisturbed forests and other terrestrial ecosystems. The second initiative, the second strategy, which is not less important, is the local strategy. So all people should take care of their local vegetation cover, and especially in Czech Republic, which is relatively distant from all oceanic sources of moisture. We need to help the ecosystems to increase their water holding capacity, and how to do that is a separate and complex question, but apparently water retention measures are very promising. And also we need to gradually restore the species composition of the old tree stands, of spruce stands in Czech Republic that are currently attacked by the bark beetle, because, as we have discussed, these ecosystems had been disturbed beyond the threshold where they could restore by themselves. They now cannot restore by themselves, and they need our help and our wise intervention. So acting on a local scale, protecting and restoring the water holding and water regulatory capacity of vegetation cover on the one hand, and also promoting more large-scale efforts on preserving native ecosystems elsewhere in Russia and elsewhere in the world, in the Amazon, should be a mix of measures that will bring us success and help us to ensure good environment, good climate, good water cycle for many generations of humans to enjoy and to thrive. Thank you.